this episode, Daily Sabah's editorial coordinator, Dr. Mehmet Çelik, will be joining us to discuss the latest round of peace talks in Istanbul and U.S. ambassador to Turkey and Donald Trump's special envoy for Syria, Thomas Barak's statements about Syria, and also to discuss the Israeli genocide in occupied Gaza Strip. But before we start the discussions, let's take a look at this news report.
Amerika Başkanı Sayın Trump'ın dönüm noktası niteliğindeki açıklamaları sonrasında Avrupa ülkelerinin de Suriye'ye yönelik yaptırımları kaldırma kararı almasından büyük memnuniyet duyuyoruz.
Syria has entered a new era following the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime, with the Syrian people now leading efforts to rebuild their country and shape its political future. Türkiye supports this transition, focusing on long-term regional stability, national reconciliation, and the full restoration of Syria's territorial integrity.
Suriye halkını ve hükümetini, komşuları ve kardeşleri olarak inşallah bundan sonra da tüm imkanlarımızla destekleyeceğiz.
Türkiye reaffirmed its readiness to continue supporting Syria in various fields under the framework of mutual agreements and shared regional priorities. Emphasizing the importance of cooperation based on mutual respect and national sovereignty, Ankara is committed to maintaining its constructive role during Syria's ongoing transition.
Suriye istikrara ve huzura kavuştukça inancımız odur ki bundan tüm komşuları, bölgedeki bütün ülkeler kazançlı çıkacaktır. Her türlü engelleme girişimine rağmen ülkelerinin birlik, dirlik ve bütünlüğü için sabırla çalışan Suriye hükümetini canı gönülden tebrik ediyorum.
Those were the statements from President Erdoğan about what is going on in Syria, but we have been going on a lot in this week in the names of diplomacy. Mehmet Çelik, welcome once again to Anews, to Diplomacy. You are more of a host to this show than I am because I am a guest host now.
Good to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for you to joining us as well, because it's been a hectic week, isn't it? So many things has happened. Let's talk about the Russia-Ukraine peace talks first. We weren't expecting so much from it because the first one was kind of a disaster, wasn't it? The attendees weren't here, they were going to attend, then they didn't attend, and that was a diplomatic problem. Now we have an outcome, a limited outcome, but an outcome. They said a prisoner exchange. We were expecting a ceasefire as soon as possible, but from the June 2nd, 2025 meetings in Istanbul, a prisoner exchange has come out. What would you say about that?
Well, first of all, you're very right that the expectations were very high in the first round of the talks in Istanbul. But those expectations actually didn't meet the outcome was much lower in terms of a tangible outcome than the high expectations that we had ahead of the meetings, as even a meeting between the leaders was expected. Mr. Trump was at his golf tour at the time, and his attendance and his stopover in Istanbul was even expected. But nevertheless, a prisoner exchange came out of that meeting. Now, in the same meeting, I think in the second meeting, the expectations were more realistic. And the outcome, I think, was expected, an expected outcome, a ceasefire, something more something bigger than a mere exchange of prisoners wasn't expected from this meeting, but this was the outcome, an exchange of prisoners. Nevertheless, the meeting started about 2 hours late. Yeah. It lasted about an hour, 20 minutes, and or nearly 2 hours, and then there was a press statement, press conference by the Ukrainian delegation. Kremlin followed afterwards, etc. I think right now, expecting a ceasefire, especially from a meeting that was, I would say, overshadowed by the Ukrainian attack on Russian military infrastructure or military bases.
40 planes, isn't
40
it?
planes, and it's nearly $7 trillion US dollars worth of damage. But aside from the damage on the military sides, I think the psychological effect of that was very big as well, and it overshadowed the meeting. Still, the conflict itself is not a simple one to solve. It has very deep historical background and historical causes that resurges this meeting from time to time, this conflict from time to time, and it has been going on since the occupation of Crimea. Yeah. And even before that, the conflict has been there. So expecting a ceasefire of a war that has very deep historic roots, it's in 2 rounds of meetings, I think it's not realistic in itself. So what we expect, Putin was speaking to Donald Trump yesterday, and ahead of this phone conversation, he said that he will be responding to this attack by Ukraine. Ukraine has already attacked some of the infrastructure that connects some of the bridges, and that tension in terms of military confrontation is not calming down. And I think the sides are strategically doing this to have a psychological or leverage over the other as these meetings are taking place. But I think it's counterproductive, because at a time where the sides have come close to a ceasefire, or at least a negotiation table is being set, these high expectations from the meeting, these steps that further escalate tensions, do not help reaching a ceasefire. Even the note that was presented to the Ukrainian side from Moscow delegation, in itself is not very realistic for the Ukrainian side to accept. Some of the articles there basically say, I have control, or I can have interference, or I can have influence over your domestic affairs. And that puts a big question mark on Ukraine's sovereignty. And this is not something that the Ukrainians would accept in terms of the negotiation articles. So right now there is this psychological warfare between the sides. Of course, this is also reflected on the field where there is, big airstrikes or bombings, and there's civilian casualties at the times. So we are not very close to a ceasefire, I'm afraid. And I am afraid that the 3rd round of talks may not even take place at this point, where the tensions are very, not at a calm atmosphere right now. So that brings us to square one. Yeah. We are going backwards 3 steps, and when we are taking 1 step forward, 3 steps back, we end up going in terms of trying to achieve a ceasefire to this conflict that has been, on the top of the agenda for the whole world, basically. It affects not only this region, not only the Black Sea region, but when we talk about grain deal, for example, that was facilitated, thankfully, by Turkey and the United States, yep. The United Nations, it affects food security. It affects energy security, for example. So it is not a conflict that only affects the 2 countries or the region, but it's an international conflict now where, somehow I think the sides needs to have a compromising position towards one another. At least realistic compromises should be expected if there is a ceasefire on the agenda.
Well, your points are actually, there are some important points to highlight. With what I was really interested in, the fact that the meeting started, you said they started it with 2 hours delay. I think it is a statement of itself, isn't it? Because yes. This is a feeling that we are here, but we are not willing to have a conversation with you. We are only doing this out of courtesy for you. But when we look at the situation like this, as you mentioned, the ceasefire is not coming anytime soon. But when we consider this, at least there's a table that they sit beside, because the tension is so high and the statements from Putin is so intense. On the other hand, the United States is making statements that they're angry with both Russia and they're angry with Ukraine as well. In the United States is such an important part of this conflict, and Donald Trump is saying that he's angry with both of the leaders. So there is Zelensky, Ukrainian president, and he expressed a frustration with Russia's negotiations tactics, accusing Moscow of delaying peace efforts. but Ukraine is doing the same as well with attacks as well. So what would you say about the war of games, war of strategy? Do you think that it is going to drag on for a while?
Well, I think this is war. And all these tactics and strategies, the sides will try to do that, be it information warfare, be it psychological statements coming from the leaders, be it tactical operations against strategic infrastructure. I mean, all goes when you're at war. When you're at a very hard military confrontation, you utilize all instruments that are available, be it psychological instruments, be it military instruments, in terms of information, in terms of diplomatic moves. You try to utilize all of them to have leverage over the other side. And at a war, this is what happens. But when it comes to Trump, you mentioned Trump's position regarding this war. Trump's interest in ending this war is a tactical one for himself, because he pledged to end the wars. He wants to be remembered as a leader that end the wars.
And he said
not
24
started.
hours.
He said 24 hours, and now he's having a difficulty in
24 weeks has passed.
Yes, in materializing this pledge that he made to his voters at home. Internationally, ending this war will also bring him a prestige. He sees this war as a burden at many levels to the U.S. taxpayers. So he wants to be done with this Ukraine war because he has bigger things on agenda for himself. Of course, the war between Ukraine and Russia, it's not necessarily simply a war between the two nations. Or between two sovereign states. It's a war that Russia has been strategically carrying out against Ukraine. And this is a message to the Western world. This is a move against the Western world, or the Western bloc, or the NATO, basically, and the United States in the international arena. So, of course, there is that aspect of the war, and this is also part of the U.S. Strategy in reinstating its hegemony around the world. That superpower in decline right now, what we have for the United States, and hence why we see all these terrorists against Russia, for example. This is Trump realizing that there is that decline in the U.S. Superpower internationally. There is now a multipolar world. There's more than one player in the game that is affecting the game's rules. I mean, we talk about China,
doesn't
India.
want to accept that, though, does he?
I'm sorry?
He doesn't want to accept that.
He doesn't want to accept that, but his moves are actually very realistic. They see that there is this new equation, there's new multipolar world, and he wants to have the U.S. interests protected, the U.S. position in this new world order as one of the leading countries, if not the leading country or the leading state in this new order. So he's basically raising, he has high stakes in ensuring that this materializes for the U.S. interests. But he wants to be done with the Ukraine war and move on to China, basically. I think he sees this China to the Ukraine conflict something that drags on his foot, and he wants to be done with it, to move on to Asia Pacific and other bigger problems as he sees economic war between U.S. and China. So he wants to be done with that, but it is not something that is happening, and it is frustrating Trump. Trump is not someone that is very patient, be it diplomatically, and this affects his diplomatic language as well. But at this point, when the negotiations are failing, when the sides have, especially Ukrainian sides, for example, is more parallel. Ukraine's position is more parallel with the European position, and that is to not really compromise just for the sake of ending the war. They want to escalate the tensions because that security mechanism for Europe is necessary, ensuring that Ukraine does not, look like the losing side when the ceasefire takes place, when a negotiation is resulted with a positive outcome or some tangible results. They want to make sure that Ukraine and the backing Europe does not look like they have lost against Russia.
Well, when we consider it like that, what would you say? I'm sorry. What would you say about the ceasefire process that is happening? Because Trump wants it immediately, as he wants everything to happen immediately. He wants the end of the war happen immediately as well. Do you think that it is going to happen?
Well, in his conversation yesterday with Vladimir Putin, following that, he said it was a good conversation, but not a conversation that will lead to an immediate peace. I think Trump is very realistic now, compared to his previous remarks or previous thoughts about this conflict ahead of him being elected. Now he sees that, to be realistic, this is not something that can end very easily. So that ceasefire, I'm not sure if it will come very soon. If the response from Russia against Ukraine following this Ukraine attack, if it is something that is very strategic, something really big, not just a mere response to save face, I think the tensions will further escalate, and that means a step further away from ceasefire rather than trying to give diplomacy a chance. And even though these first 2 rounds of meetings in Istanbul were small steps compared to the high expectations, at least there's a platform that was trying to get a step closer to a ceasefire. Now, I'm not sure if we are, if those gains that were, that at least diplomatic closeness or diplomatic moves towards one another that were achieved in the first 2 meetings will lead to a third meeting in Istanbul.
Well, speaking of Turkey, I think it is important to highlight that Turkey has been initiating so many peace talks at once and has achieved many and is trying to be an important part of the Ukraine and Russia conflict as well. But previously we have spoken about President Erdoğan's statements about Syria. So let's focus on that before we move on to our next package of the news program as well. So what would you say about the latest statements of President Erdoğan regarding Syria? Because he has been initiating so many things in the international way. He initiated the acceptance of the United States for Syria, for example. So right now he's still initiating so many important steps for Syria. What would you say about his steps he's taken? He's making so many important diplomatic relationships for Syria and with Syria.
Well, since the beginning of the war in 2011, Turkey has been siding with the Syrian people, and that position has not changed in 2025. Still, a country that suffered from war and destruction and displacement at many different levels. Syria's destruction wasn't just buildings and roads. The destruction of, it was a psychological destruction, it was an institutional destruction. Now there is a rebuilding of a country in the post-conflict period at all levels, basically. Not just roads and buildings and bridges and etc., but institutionally Syria needs to be redeveloped. Security-wise, it needs to ensure that that is established, an order is established in Syria. Economically, Syria has suffered. That economic activity must be established now. For all these, several things needed. First of all, Syria was facing many different sanctions by the Western countries as well as the United States. Now, through Turkey's influence, diplomatic influence or diplomatic interference between the United States and Syria. As you know, when Mr. Trump was in Riyadh he announced that the sanctions will be paused and will be stopped for Syria as they need that initial boost, so that they can actually get on their feet, basically, right? And same thing will be happen as Turkey is trying to make sure that a solid removal of sanctions are coming from Europe as well, because without sanctions removed, Syria will have no contact with the outside of the world, and they need that aid to come in. They need that investment to come in. They need that economic transactions to take place. They need their flights to move from Damascus or Aleppo to other cities, and they need to get engaged with the outside of the world. For that to happen also, something that is as equally important needs to happen, and that is security. Turkey is also ensuring that Syria's internal order is secured. There's, of course, several terrorist organizations within Syria still very present, and Syria needs support to ensure that those terrorist groups do not affect, or their effect is minimized, that threatens the security within the country. Of course, in addition to these 2 points, security and economic activity and sanctions, Syria also needs its territorial integrity and political unity protected. And Turkey is also pushing forward for that. As you know, the YPG presence in northern Syria was a threat, seen as a threat, not only to Turkey's security along its border, due to PKK relationship between, as they are organically linked between the PKK and the YPG, but also it is a threat to Syria's territorial integrity, as they had their aim to establish an autonomous region, or maybe a separate entity within Syria, and that is not something that the new administration in Syria, led by Ahmed al-Shara, will accept, and Turkey is supporting that process of ensuring that territorial integrity is protected, but also internal unity is also protected. There's many different ethnic and religious groups in Syria, and it's a very fragile process, especially ensuring that authority is accepted by all different groups within Syria. It's a fragile moment that will need support, and Turkey has been leading this initiative to ensure that Syria is supported at many different levels: militarily, economically, diplomatically, in terms of intelligence sharing. So, Turkey for the past 14 years not only opened doors to our Syrian guests escaping the Assad regime. It didn't only do that, but it ensured the terror activity was clear from eastern Syria, that we're trying to establish a new entity within Syria. And that support from day one is still continuing in 2025.
Still, Syria is trying to become a quote-unquote a proper country right now, because they're trying to integrate with the international ways. They have been in war for so many years to build an establishment that is...
Well, institutionally, they need to re-establish themselves. It's not, like I said, it's not just buildings, the infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt, but institutionally, you're rebuilding basically a new country. And good thing is that they have a country like Turkey to support them, that not only bilaterally supporting Syria, but Turkey is also working very hard to ensure that third countries are also establishing this relationship with Syria as well.
Like United States.
Yes.
Well, let's take a look at our news package about this now, because as we have spoken about, Turkey has embraced Syria's shift into a new phase of recovery and reconstruction, highlighting of the importance of both regional and international cooperation for a lasting peace. Let's take a look.
Ukraine on Wednesday released new footage of its audacious drone strike on Russian military air bases over the weekend. The footage showed attack drones targeting numerous Russian strategic bombers and other military aircraft in an operation codenamed Spider's Web. Satellite imagery suggested the attacks had caused substantial damage, although the two sides gave conflicting accounts of the extent of the destruction. Reuters reported exclusively, citing two U.S. officials, that the drone attack hit as many as 20 Russian warplanes, destroying around 10 of them. The U.S. officials described the attack as highly significant, with one of them warning that it could drive Moscow to a far more severe negotiating position in peace talks to end the war. On Wednesday, Russian President Vladimir Putin told U.S. President Donald Trump in a telephone conversation that Moscow would have to respond to both the drone attack as well as a deadly bridge bombing that Russia blamed on Kyiv. Ukraine has not commented on the bridge attacks, but has taken responsibility for Sunday's attack on Russian airfields. The Kremlin said Trump told Putin that Washington was not informed in advance of the Ukrainian attacks. Trump, meanwhile, described Wednesday's conversation with Putin as good, but added it was, quote, not a conversation that will lead to immediate peace.
Вони готові до обмінів, бо це їм потрібно.
Earlier on Wednesday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky proposed implementing a ceasefire until such time as a meeting can be arranged with Putin. But Putin questioned the point of peace talks with Ukraine after accusing it of ordering the bombing of bridges, which he called terrorist attacks, in some of his most hawkish remarks on the outlook for peace.
The attack was clearly aimed at civilians. This fact confirms our concerns that the already illegitimate regime in Kyiv that once seized power is degenerating into a terrorist organization, and its sponsors are becoming accomplices of terrorists.
Meanwhile, in Brussels, NATO defense ministers met to discuss continued military and strategic support for Ukraine. Kyiv's defense minister said Ukraine's allies voiced willingness to pay for defense manufacturing by Ukrainian companies in allied countries, but did not specify the potential value of the offer.
Well, with the light of that, let's take a look at Daily Sabah's front page and see what they were talking about for today. Well, on the front page, they have started with something related to economy, but we have been talking about Syria quite a lot. So let's take a look at Hakan Fidan's statements. Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan said President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan's diplomatic efforts for Syria yielded results with the lifting sanctions, and Turkey is now stepping in support in the southern neighbor's development. This is quite important, isn't it? Because we have been highlighting it previously for a while as well. So what do you make out of the minister's statement?
Well, as you mentioned, our headline today was regarding the inflation in Turkey. And there is a very strong, actually, disinflation and positive trends in the economy. So we rightfully put that on our headline.
Yep.
But Syria is a big topic in Turkey's foreign policy agenda. And, you know, as we were just talking about Turkey's initiatives and how Turkey sees such an importance in the stability in Syria, Mr. Fidan, you know, basically, he says that a great deal of cooperation is needed, a great deal of development is needed for Syria, for that reestablishment or rebuilding of the state at many different levels. What he focused on is one of the areas is fight against terrorism. Mm-hmm. And as you know, there is a four countries actually of the region. They're coming together to establish this joint effort against Daesh or other terrorist groups. And this is a very important initiative, I think, because terrorism in this region does not affect only one country. What happens in Syria does not stay in Syria, and it has a you know, trickle down effect on other countries, be it in Iraq, be it Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan are also part of this efforts. And I think that security mechanism, if it is established for Syria, it will be very important as the instability pushes away all other developments in all other areas. Economic activity will not take place if you don't have security. If you don't have security, you cannot rebuild infrastructure. If you don't have security, people's activity is limited. So when that happens, and displacement takes place, and when that happens, you know, you cannot ensure a country that has suffered from war for many years to start rebuilding itself. So I think this fight against terrorism and this new establishment of new mechanism is very important for Syria and the region. But as we were just talking about, you know, mm-hmm. Syria's redevelopment and Turkey's engagement from the, you know, reinitiating the airports to roads to energy. We are, you know, to reestablishing electricity, for example. Turkey is there. Turkey is there. Turkey was there actually in northern Syria for many years since the war started. And in some areas that were, you know, moderate opposition was controlling, Turkey was there to ensure that the daily life of citizens were ongoing, and now Turkey is in the whole country supporting Syrian government, supporting Syrian people to ensure that that daily routine does not face any obstacles from happening.
Well, what a tangible region we are in, isn't it? Because we have been talking about the bullet points within, what, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and it's been a lot to uncover, and we are still just scratching the surface.
Yes.
So when we consider it like that, we are going to move to another situation in the Middle East. Khamenei made a statement that U.S. nuclear bid is not in Iran's interest. This is quite important for the Middle East as well. They have been having quite a couple of conversations, but it didn't turn out so well. So what would you say about this?
Well, as you know, Mr. Trump had removed the United States from the Iran talks in 2018 when he was in his previous term. And now there is a new round of talks. Basically, what Khamenei says is that there is a purpose for this uranium enrichment, and it's a non-military one, but the United States, especially for its regional interests, as well as for Israel's security, sees Iran's any activity related to uranium enrichment or nuclear capabilities or nuclear activities, it sees that as a threat. Now, there's two foundational problems here. One is that the Iranian side sees this activity as or the U.S. influence and interference in Iran against the regime as establishments in 1979. And the United States sees basically Iran's existence within this framework of nuclear activity as a threat to its regional interests as well as Israel's security. How to move away from that, I am not sure if that is possible unless the United States really comes to terms with the regime and in a very sheer and transparent manner, where they can actually discuss what this nuclear activity means. And this goes same for Iran. I mean, for them to be able to talk about their nuclear activity through maybe even third parties, through some international organizations. But nevertheless, I think that the diplomacy is given a chance, but the sides are not psychologically at a time where they would like to get close together. Of course, this diplomatic initiative is being used, and they also have a different talk, a different negotiation with the Europeans, the E3 and Iran. But with the United States, I think it's a more hard talk that is needed if the diplomacy wants to be given a chance. And at this point, I'm not sure if there's a really good atmosphere for that.
Well, we're sure are going to take a look on this in the future times, because probably we are going to be dealing this for a while. As you have mentioned, the diplomacy is nowhere close as of right now. But we have been speaking about Ukraine for a while, previously in the beginning of our program, and we have a statement from NATO boss Rutte confirming the plans for massive defense capacity boost. And it is actually ironic that it has come during the times of the ceasefire talks in Istanbul. What do you make of that?
Well, as I mentioned, the war between Ukraine and Russia, or the Russian invasion of Ukrainian territory, is not necessarily something that is, something that has emerged simply. Of course, there's elements, but it is beyond simple elements of bilateral disagreements, be it historical disagreement or territorial disagreements, or some economic interests that clash against one another, and now we have the dispute. It goes beyond that. Why? Because Russia is not fighting Ukraine. Russia is fighting Ukraine and its NATO backers. I mean, the United States, the European countries. Where does Ukraine get its military equipment from? Where does the Ukraine get its defense mechanisms from? Of course, from NATO allies, right? So Ukraine is basically leaning, it's using this backup from NATO. So Russia sees this fight as a fight between Russian side as well as the NATO bloc. When this is happening, NATO needs its defense mechanism to be strengthened. And this is something that Mr. Trump was complaining about, that European countries are not doing their share when it comes to defense mechanism. And I think this is, if, in this tense moment for international affairs, NATO needs to ensure that its defense capabilities are there in case tensions boil harder. But I think more than that, it has this deterrence effect. If NATO's security mechanism is not strong enough, or it doesn't have this deterrence effect, then it defeats the purpose of having this bloc as NATO is a security alliance.
Sure. Well, those were the bullet points that we are going to deal with for today. Speaking of Ukraine, we have a news footage actually about Ukraine's strike on Russia. Let's take a look at what did Putin and Trump said.
The result of the voting is as follows: 14 votes in favor, 1 vote against, 0 abstention.
The United Kingdom voted in favour of this resolution today because the intolerable situation in Gaza needs to end. We are determined to see an end to this war, secure the release of the hostages held by Hamas, and alleviate the catastrophic humanitarian situation for Palestinians in Gaza.
Let us be clear. This failure will not go down in records as a mere procedural footnote. It will be remembered as a complicity, a green light for continued annihilation, a moment where the entire world was expecting action, but yet again this council was blocked and prevented by one member from carrying out its responsibility.
President, I would like to respond to a disturbing comment made by a member. And I just want to reiterate that Israel has a right to defend itself. And it has taken numerous measures to limit harm to civilians and address humanitarian needs. The loss of civilian life in Gaza is tragic. We all mourn this.
Now online we have joining us from Islamabad, Pakistan, is political analyst Javed Rana. Javed, thank you so much for joining us here on Anews once again, here on Diplomacy. Well, let's talk about what is going on with the Israel as well. So the genocide in Israel the genocide that Israel does in Gaza continues for a while, and the attacks are continuing. What would you say about the latest situation?
Well, I think I was hearing this was the fifth time that USA has blocked any ceasefire agreement, the supply of the aid to Gaza. This is an extraordinary situation in the history, in the history of the mankind, where a West, more particularly the USA, has been blocking every tangible effort which could have long ago brought this genocide to an end. Now it means that there is obviously a division within the West. Some of the countries are not willing to support the apartheid state as much as it used to do because of the public pressure. But one thing seems to be clear, that the USA is not going to desert Israel at any cost. So we have to see what is at stake, because of which the US is now putting up with all criticism, all kind of criticism. It has been banning international students just because they were protesting against apartheid state. It has been scrutinizing everything in the USA, which could have possibly revived protest against Israel. And then internationally speaking, it has left no stone unturned when it comes to suppressing the efforts to bring a peace in the Middle East. Now, in that context, again, this is a purely an evangelical agenda, There is an evangelical government in the White House, and they are pursuing Israel's theological and religious agenda, which talks about the greater Israel, something I've been saying time and again. But given the fact that these are the ground realities we are seeing there. We have seen 22 Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. That is a bigger indicator that this expansion plan would continue. By and large, they have occupied Gaza. Just very small parts have not been occupied so far, which they would, it looks like. And then they are also expanding to the occupied West Bank, and 20 to 25 kilometers have been occupied of Syria, and in a similar fashion, they have occupied territories in Lebanon. Something Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, has been saying with the proud that under his administration, the territories of Israel is being expanded. And they have a map inside Israel's parliament, which by and large includes much of the Middle East. So the bigger trouble here is that there is no united, concerted response on the part of the Muslim countries, more particularly from the Arab states. And then what we are seeing now in response from the West, it looks like that Israel is more a liability for the West, more particularly for France and now for the UK. But again, they have to undo what they have already done, and that is they have to suspend the supplies of the weapons. They have to suspend the sharing of intelligence. They have to do everything which makes it sure that Israel is sanctioned in an effective manner, where Israel is crippled not to continue with this genocide. That is not happening on the part of Europe. Europe is already in crisis. Its focus is obviously the Ukraine war. It wants to win that war or at least neutralize that war. That is not happening. So whatever we are hearing from the European countries, more particularly UK and France, that only indicates that they are basically facing the heat of the public pressure, and because of which they have to do something where they are being seen by the public that they are doing something to bring an end to this genocide, and they are no longer part of the genocide. I think their actions so far do not match with their words. They need to do a lot on this issue.
Well, lastly, really shortly, I would like to ask you your opinion about the announcement that White House made in June 2nd, 2025. Israel endorsed the U.S. proposed plan for a ceasefire, 60 days truce, actually. Do you think that it is going to be happening, or do we have key challenges?
Well, we have to see what happened with the previous ceasefire agreements. Both of the ceasefire agreements were violated, and more particularly of the January this year's agreement. And under this agreement, the Israeli troops had to be withdrawn from Gaza, and there had to be negotiations for the withdrawal of the troops. So instead of withdrawing the troops or talking with the Hamas to bring an end to the Israeli occupation, Israel opted essentially to continue with its aggression and continue with this genocide. The reason being was that Hamas could not have been defeated at that particular point of time. There was a lot of perception that Hamas has won this war. Now, the criteria of who's winning and who's losing is quite simple. Israel has already said that we have to eliminate Hamas altogether. It's a zero-sum game. They have not been able to do so far, despite the fact that the Arab countries behind the scene is supporting apartheid Israel, despite the fact that there is no supplies of the weapons to Hamas, despite the fact that the Iran, by and large, has been cornered. Its supplies of the military weapons is not there. This is also despite the fact that the Hezbollah support from the Lebanon is not there, and nonetheless, Israel has not been able to even, I would say, contain Hamas in a manner where it can remove resistance altogether. Yes. So it has resorted to violence in a very, very systematic manner. We have seen that now even the so-called this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is basically comprising of the CIA and Mossad's contractors, and it is a kind of espionage operation. And during last couple of days, I think far more than 100 people have been killed at the aid distribution centers.
Yes.
People are being killed there. That is a death trap. That indicates that Israel has a bigger plan, and that everybody knows, to expel all people from Gaza so that it can fully occupy the territory.
Well, what is going to happen, we are going to see as it unfolds. Thank you so much for joining us, Javed. And that now brings us to the end of our program. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.